Welcome to the Think Fitness Life podcast, where we bring the mind, body, and gym together so you can improve your health, increase performance, and live your best life. For more information, visit thinkfitnesslife.com. Here are your hosts, Matt Gluckman and Eric Menchie.
So this was a question that came up for someone, but you asked me to write a blog on insulin and to go over kind of what it's about. Because I think people hear it and they get this bad thing that it's this bad hormone, but in reality, it's not. It's a hormone that literally helps us survive. And we need this in our body to open doors. It's an enzyme, it's a hormone, and it triggers things to be open so we can pull nutrients in to grow, to survive, and not wither away and be catabolic. So the biggest thing kind of starting with this to realize is insulin's not the problem per se, like the molecule. It's when we have high levels of it, constant levels of it, or low levels of it.
Right.
And that's where it becomes the problem. So for to keep it simple, not dive too far in, like insulin, it's released from the pancreas when we eat. And if you want a big spike in insulin, you'll go eat like Skittles or something very refined sugar-esque. That will really spike your insulin levels up. Protein will raise your insulin levels, but we're talking different spikes. So you have smaller spikes with protein and maybe more meals with fat, but higher spikes if you have like a candy bar, or say you start drinking soda and are eating candy with it. Like that's going to be a high spike. What the body does, because we can't have high circulating levels of glucose in our blood, it's got to mitigate that. So it releases insulin to take care of that. And think of like insulin is like FedEx or UPS. Like you have packages that need to go somewhere and they're going to deliver it to houses so people can take it in and use that. If not, you just have packages everywhere and no cell gets to use it. So it takes nutrients, proteins, amino acids, takes high glucose into the cells because it will open up the GLUT4 receptor into the cells, so the cells will pull it in. And the problem is when it becomes too high, like that's where people are getting in trouble, and we start hearing of diabetes and metabolic dysfunction. That's where it becomes a issue when we're talking insulin. So I think people hear it, they think insulin's bad, and they automatically blame insulin. But it's not really the case. It's the behaviors that are leading to insulin.
Best insulin.
And that's where it's going to be a problem.
In terms of insulin, I think most people hear insulin too and think just about diabetes. And in reality, it's also associated with weight gain or weight loss, or lack of weight loss, So I think, understanding kind of the basic structure and fundamentals of it is really important. But what causes insulin levels to rise? Is it just excess sugar intake? What are some of the other reasons? Like, is it just genetics?
So it's more or less, it's all related to blood glucose levels. And if you have it, and this is where, you ever seen a type 1 diabetic? They're always monitoring their blood glucose levels. They might have an insulin pump. Well, that person can't produce insulin. So they need it. So when they eat something sugary, they need it to bump their levels up to deal with that blood glucose so they don't faint. They also might need it because if their levels are too low, they will also faint too, and things will go awry. The other side, type 2 diabetes, we're becoming resistant to that. Like there's too much high levels of blood glucose that the body is shooting out insulin, but the cells aren't responding to that insulin. Like it's overload. Like you're just collecting all these packages that are being delivered, but you can't use them. And I think that's where it becomes a problem of, let's start first off, weight gain is when we're in a constantly fed state, which means we're not in starvation. We didn't just wake up. We're not fasting. Our body is full. Like it's in an absorption state. So it's absorbing all the nutrients. What happens is people start they stay in these fed states throughout the day. They don't eat, take a break for 3 or 4 hours, then eat again. People like are constantly eating and they're staying in this fed state. So that triggers insulin to always be working and always opening doors to cells to pull in all the nutrients that you're taking in. Now, if you're taking in processed sugar, well, that's just going to literally lead to increase of fatty acid storage. So the downsides of insulin, right? It's going to inhibit lipase, which is the molecule or enzyme that breaks fat down. So your fat utilization plummets. It's going to spare fat, so it's going to store it. It's going to increase fatty acid synthesis. So it'll take that glucose that it doesn't need readily. A lot of it happens in muscle. It will take it and says, well, we don't need it, and we'll put some more carbons on it. We'll make this a fatty acid. We'll store it as fat for later. So that's like the main path where people are thinking high glucose, and why obesity is associated with type 2 diabetes is because people are storing the blood glucose as fatty acid used for later.
Right.
It'll pull the glucose into fat cells. So fat cells are literally going to fuel themselves with glucose and start that process, increasing overall fat. So this is where people get in trouble.
And then, on the flip side of that too, they get into trouble because then they're unable to access that fat for fuel later, right? So it's like, it's fine that we store fats from time to time, but then it becomes a problem when all our body's good at is storing fats, storing energy in the fat cells, and that inability to access that energy later is when it kind of piles up.
Right. And then you get in the state of overweight, and then it becomes hard to lose weight if your insulin levels are always high, or if you don't have muscle mass. So muscle, and this is where muscle is important, and they just came out with the Washington Post did it, that actually resistance training is as important or more important for longevity than cardio training, because muscle will use 80% of that blood glucose from the insulin reaction. So your muscles will pull that in. Now, if you're not someone who has a lot of muscles, what's happening? Well, then your other cells are going to pull it in. So this is the importance of resistance training in maintaining muscle mass, is the muscles are going to literally
pull that energy away from the ability for the fat to steal it.
Exactly. So that's why you hear a lot of us trainers say, like, the importance of muscle mass. Yeah, it's not to look good. I mean, you can go down that avenue if you want, but it's literally to use energy substrates and pull it in, because your muscles will pull in fat too. It'll pull in glycogen and glucose that it needs to store, and it'll be metabolic, and you're burning that consistently. And that's the mechanisms of why you want lean body mass, is because that's where a lot of the blood glucose will get dumped into.
I think that is absolutely important to point out, because the classic line of idle time is the devil's workshop, even in the body. Like if you're not leading from the front, if you're not giving it a reason to use its muscle, to use it as the kind of primal animal that it was designated for, then the fat cells are just going to start to suck up all that energy, and it becomes a problem when it becomes too much, right? Classic line, just be balanced. So if you're I guess what I'm getting at here is this becomes a problem if this is your consistent state of internally of what you're consuming, and it really starts with, like, look at your breakfast, look at your lunch, look at your dinner. Are you having spikes of sugar in your breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Like, you broke it down and looked at the carbs, protein, fat ratios and sugars? Or is it a lot of sugars? Because the odds are, look at the statistics. There are in every meal that you're getting, and you're leading to your own weight gain and higher levels of insulin.
Yep. And on the other side of that, with high levels of insulin, right, we go a step further. This is going to affect more guys. They just came out with a study recently about this in, like, balding, that, if you have high insulin levels, like, it's going to lower your SHBG, which is your sex hormone binding globulin. What that does is that you have more testosterone, which is going to turn into dihydrotestosterone, which if it genetically, it will bind to the receptors in the head and create baldness. And this is where they're seeing with high sugary drinks is leading to male pattern baldness, because it's a binding thing. Like you're creating an internal thing, and hormones are like upregulating or downregulating because of that. Now, if you have high insulin, you're going to have low SHBG, right? So it flips it. But also, that's also reactive to if you're eating a lot of sugars. And if you're eating a lot of sugars, well, that's going to drop your testosterone about 25% post like 2 hours after you eat the sugar. So as you can see from like let's say a guy standpoint, right? Females might be a little bit different because they're going to metabolize it different, and they can still drop their testosterone levels, and insulin's going to have a different effect on them. But from a guy standpoint, if you're looking to trying to increase weight loss and gain muscle mass, and you're eating high sugary foods, like this is what happens. Like you're kind of fighting against yourself because you're doing the workouts, but you're eating too much sugar, so your insulin's staying elevated, and you're not actually grasping like the benefits from testosterone, the benefits from everything else that goes into the system. And this is where if your muscles aren't going to pull that in, you're not going to gain muscle mass. You can't deal with that blood glucose. So then it becomes a repetitive cycle of like, insulin's up. All right, we got to figure it out. Well, we don't have muscle mass, put it in fat. And that's what we're seeing is leading to literally metabolic dysfunction. It's starting in the muscle because people don't have enough of it, that they can't deal with this. And now we're becoming diabetic because we're creating a system that's just overrunning itself.
So what about, because this sounds like a bigger issue in people who are not inactive and people who are just starting. Is that pretty accurate? This is probably not as big of a threat in people who are already fairly active and fit and exercising regularly.
Well, they just have to be aware of like the pathways that like, yes, you can be fit and you can work out, but it doesn't mean you can, eat whatever you want. And there's some people out there and coaches I've heard if you have a hard workout, you can go eat Lucky Charms. Like yes, because like you're gonna spike insulin a lot. But if you look at bodybuilders, right? And you're not, and because you were one at one point, not as this, but they've gone into a lot of insulin drugs, right? And they get these distended stomachs. What they were doing is like they're trying to recapture like the moment like they can spike insulin, they're becoming more anaerobic, so they can pull in more nutrients to get bigger faster. But then they were starting to realize their things are going awry because there's too much insulin, and they're actually like putting strain on their body because it has its own insulin levels. That was just a tactic to try to enhance it, right? So it just became problematic for them, and they were really starting to gain like these weird weight gain and weird things because the body was just putting mass wherever it wanted to. And that's another reason why we saw people get so big in like their off season before they cut down, is because they were allowing their bodies to do this. So it is something that will open up the cells, but on the flip side, you can't always have that high because it's always going to promote growth, which means like muscle mass. Yes, we want to increase lean body, but if you're always in a fed state, you're always growing. Like, I'll bring this in, like mTOR, like will always be activated. And research has shown that high levels of mTOR with sugar lead to increase of cancer growth and upregulation of diseases and cancer. So that's a huge thing. And I think a lot of it comes down to the processed foods we're eating. Like, is this processed refined sugar? That's going to cause a high spike. Because if it's not, if you're eating sweet potatoes and like rice that's been cooled, right, that's not going to have a big spike. And it also goes to how you're going to eat it on your plate. If you eat carbs first, you're going to get a huge spike in insulin. But if you eat proteins and vegetables first on your plate, or a fat, then you do the carbs last, the insulin level wasn't as high of a spike. So there's ways that people can start programming like their eating to say, hey, I'm going to eat my protein first and vegetables first. Then I'm going to go to the carbohydrate source. And usually by then, people are already kind of full, but the spike of insulin won't be as much because you already have the protein and fat in there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you really broke that down, because I do see a lot of people who, like some people who like post workout or even pre workout will eat like Sour Patch Kids and like
Yeah.
candy just to get like a bunch of dextrose really quick. And I think it's also funny, like when people first start to try to really eat healthy and move away from processed foods, like fruit tends to be the first thing that they continuously eat, that's fresh. But even that can let too many sugars sneak in, and that's a really great solution. I love that. Eat your protein first, eat your veggies first, eat your carbs last, and that'll help save your insulin production.
And I think a lot of people will get confused with fruit, and there's always this back and forth, right? Now, if you're someone, I love watermelon. If you go eat like a watermelon a day, yeah, that's going to have a pretty big spike because it's more on the higher sides on fruit sugars. But if you were to eat an apple or even a banana, because you're getting the fiber with it, it won't have the same spike of insulin. I think that's the good thing about fruit is like you have the fiber, so the spike's not going to be as drastic. Where like processed sugar, if you just took table sugar and you put that in, boom, that thing's just going to turn that thing up. And those are what you're going to see at gas stations, candy stores. Like that's what it is, and that's the mechanism. But also, as we are increasing insulin throughout the body because of, let's say, excess processed sugar intake or processed foods, you're decreasing the sensitivity of the receptors. And this is one where we want, as people, we want to increase the sensitivity by moving, by strength training, by working out, by doing sprints and high intensity exercise, because we want to turn that dial of sensitivity up to say, hey, when we have insulin turn on and release from the pancreas, we can pull what we need into the body. And then when we don't use it and we're in a, let's say, a fasted state, we can be like, okay, glucagon is going to do its thing and vice versa. But another big thing is sleep deprivation. If you get less sleep consistently, it actually reduces insulin's sensitivity. So here's the other thing. If you get less sleep, insulin doesn't respond as well. So when you eat these processed foods, what happens? Okay, well, the insulin's only going to go a little bit. It's going to respond, but it might not open all the cells that it needs to go to, right? So now you have levels of circulating things in the body. And this is where you're going to get like damage to the arterial walls, plaque buildup, because you have these things circulating in cholesterols and, the very low VLDLs will start picking these substrates up as carriers to go around. And then it'll just start putting it like, this is where plaque buildup happens. It'll put it in the body somewhere. On the flip side, if it doesn't put it somewhere, you would now have high circulating levels of this, which is going to increase blood pressure. So now you have high blood pressure, which is another association with like diabetes and health issues, because your body's just trying to figure out what to do with excess stuff in the body. So another big thing to get back on track is dial your sleep in. Dialing your sleep in on a good exercise program will help increase your insulin sensitivity. So the ability to allow insulin to do what it needs to do, which is bring amino acids into the body to inhibit catabolism. So build muscle mass, to use it to really dump that. If you do have a cheat meal, because we know everyone does, or the not best meal, your body can handle it. And I think a couple of weeks ago, that's where we were talking about, we said on the lines of, hey, if you work out hard, you can kind of eat. It was a question, can you work out hard and can you eat like crap all the time? No, you can't. But this allows you to, and you see people have it, you have that cheat meal. And if you have the muscle mass and it's a high, let's say it's a pizza, your muscles are going to pull most of that glucose in and store it away. So really, there's not a lot of excess things that the body's going to store as fat because you have muscle mass. So I think, insulin's a very big topic, and I think it gets a bad rap because it's not a bad thing. It's sugar that is the bad thing.
And I think we should move in, which was the last like 5-10 minutes, we should move into lack thereof, the other side of the equation. We talked about, obviously it's about balance. You want a good level of insulin, you want a good response. We can have too much, but we can also have too little And when we have too little, that can prevent our bodies from losing weight and burning fat appropriately. But yeah, let's talk about lack of insulin.
So we kind of mentioned it earlier. So if you have low insulin, or like you're not getting the spikes, like you're going to drop free testosterone, right? So that's also a big thing. And you don't want to do that, because now you're throwing off, like if you're trying to lose weight and your testosterone's off, so it's not going to build muscle, we kind of come full circle back to like, hey, this is what's going to happen. And also, as you start to drop insulin levels, like they can't be too low. And anyone's probably experienced this. If you ever get like really hangry and like you feel like lightheaded a little bit. Now it's very rare, because a lot of people eat pretty consistently and you can manage insulin. So this happens more if you're like type 1 diabetic, and like the insulin levels drop and you get like low blood pressure, you almost get fainting and stuff. That's usually what it is. And it's very rare that we actually see low levels of insulin, especially in a Western diet. It's just because the food is so readily available, people are eating. It's pretty non-consistent.
One thing that can happen, with the high levels of insulin, is just like people who are injecting testosterone, their body stops producing it, and then its efficiency with using it becomes less and less. So I'm guessing that's probably what, I'm not going to try to speculate how it all happens, but I'm guessing that that's a big contributing factor, is that these insulin pumps are kicked into overdrive way too often, and you end up with dysregulation and fatigue to insulin fatigue, and probably then low insulin responses.
Okay. So you're saying like not low natural insulin, like if you were fasting, like low insulin like response if you're insulin resistance. Is that what you're kind of talking about? Because if that's the mechanism, then yes, because if you have a low insulin response, that's going to be the problem, because there's not going to be enough insulin to literally help you pull the nutrients in, and it'd be a problem. Because we've seen people do fast for 30 hours plus, and they can manage their insulin, but after a while, they're going to need a boost in that to raise their levels back up. But you can go a pretty good while without having an insulin spike, because your body will run gluconeogenesis to figure that out, and glucagon will pull and create that to happen in the body, so it will happen natural. But if we don't have the response from it because of insulin resistance, then that becomes the full problem. And that's where we don't get to be able to utilize it. Fatty acids, increased weight gain, everything else starts to become a very big problem if we don't have a low, let's say, reaction to insulin. So this is going to be what we call low sensitivity, weight gain, diabetes. Then you have to really, if you want to talk diabetes, you go on diabetes. If you don't manage it, then you're going to get neuropathy. You're literally going to start cutting off cells. You're going to start dying. That's why people have to have toes cut off, some limbs issues. So you don't want to go down that path. So we really want to build a solid resistance training program to keep lean body mass on, muscle mass, to keep insulin sensitivity at the right level in our body to be sensitive when we do eat a meal. Let's say a pizza, that we can deal with that and not overload. I think
If you're ready to make steps towards improving your health or increasing your performance, book a free 30-minute call today by visiting thinkfitnesslife.com.